I was reading this week about Louis XIV of France. I don't know whether any of you know much about him. Matt's nodding his head. Yeah. I was reading a few things. He died in 1715 and was the longest reigning monarch of any European country in history. And Louis XIV was famous for calling himself the Great. He referred to himself as the state, because he believed that he was the absolute ruler, that he was the boss. Everyone served him. His funeral was spectacular, as you can imagine. He had himself a gold coffin, and he'd arranged for the cathedral to be lit very dimly, and then there was one special single candle above his coffin. This was all designed, of course, to emphasise just how important, how great Louis XIV was, or how important he thought he was. There was thousands at his funeral, and as the bishop stood up to speak, he reached down over the coffin and snuffed out the candle. And as he did this, he said, "Only God is great." It's interesting if you ask Google to define the word great. It describes it as something which is of an extent, amount, or intensity considerably above average. It also says it's an important or distinguished person, and it states the Beatles and Bob Dylan as examples of important or distinguished people. Now, this word great is one which can cause a lot of debate, isn't it? Some of us here might not consider the Beatles or Bob Dylan to be important people. Some of you might. I don't know. But there will be a lot of debate over other things as well, wouldn't there? We've all got a favourite hymn that we think is great for different reasons. We've all got our favourite translation of the Bible, the one that we think is the greatest. Perhaps we've all got a prime minister who we think was the greatest, or a car that we think is the greatest, or a football team that we think is the greatest. No, not them. And because we feel something is great, we care about it, don't we? We buy into it, we aspire to it, perhaps. And Louis XIV thought that he was the greatest. And in tonight's passage, which Carol read for us a minute ago, we see evidence of how great some people thought Jesus was. But they weren't necessarily holding him up as the right sort of great. Salome, the mother of James and John, kneels before Jesus and it says she asks him a favour, we read in verse 20. There was this perception that Jesus was going to be this all-powerful, this super king. And like any good mother, she wanted the best for her children and politely requested that her boys take seats on either side of Jesus when he's in command of God's kingdom. We see the impression of the kind of king that Jesus was going to be evident in the other disciples as too later on in the passage when we read that the other disciples, when they heard this, they were indignant. Indignant means angry or annoyed. Perhaps they were jealous that they'd asked first. But let's just backtrack a second and go back to chapter 11 in Matthew. If you've got your Bibles open, back in chapter 11 and verse 29. Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart." It's interesting to note that this is one of the only times in the Gospels that Jesus describes his inner self, his inner character. I am gentle and humble in heart. Louis XIV said at one point, "I don't need anybody, I don't need anyone, I depend on no one, for I am the greatest." Jesus could quite easily have got up and announced that he's the greatest too, couldn't he? And he wouldn't have been wrong. But instead of bragging about being the greatest, Jesus described himself as humble. How many modern day monarchs or rulers would we hear calling themselves that? As we go back into chapter 20, the passage that we're looking at this evening, in verse 28, Jesus says, "Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve." Jesus knew that his role on earth was not to be king of an earthly kingdom, but it was to serve people, it was to empower people in preparation for an eternity in his heavenly kingdom. I don't know whether you remember the birth of Prince George a few years ago, the son of Prince William and Catherine, the little boy that could one day be king. But do you remember the hype around his birth? That people camped outside the hospital for days. The press lined the streets, 24-hour news channels just covering it constantly. People went mad buying souvenirs, plates and tea towels and T-shirts, and everyone was desperate to buy the first magazines and newspapers with pictures of this new little boy in. Yet this king who we know, who we're talking about, who we follow, entered this world not in some expensive private hospital ward. People weren't queuing up to see him. People hadn't been camped out for days waiting for his arrival. And the locals weren't selling souvenirs. Well, not that we know about anyway. At this time, we remember how Jesus humbled himself. He stepped down from his majesty in heaven to be born in the flesh as a weak, frail, dependent baby into the arms of his earthly mother in a stable or even a cave. Have you ever been in a barn or somewhere where they keep animals? I'm sure you'll agree they're not the cleanest places, are they? Smelly, damp, dark. Bethlehem itself wasn't a special place either. Probably no more than 1,000 inhabitants in a town which was probably pretty run down. Humbly, Jesus entered this earth, and humbly, Jesus grew up as a boy, the son of a carpenter. And as Jesus grew up and began his ministry, we know that he had a different idea of what a king should be, the kind of king that he was going to be. Instead, he says, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. To truly understand the meaning of what Jesus is telling his disciples here, we only have to look at the life that Jesus led, understanding who Jesus was, the true meaning of the role which he took up as the Son of Man. Jesus came to earth as a servant of God. And God's servants are here to work. That's what servants do. In John 9:4, Jesus says, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Jesus understood that he'd been sent by God for a purpose. He was sent to work. He was sent to serve. And it's through his serving that we also learn that God's servants will suffer. In 3 of the Gospels, we read the same words of Jesus. The Son of Man must suffer many things. He will be rejected, slain, and raised on that 3rd day. But we also learn too, don't we, that God's servants will be rewarded. Well done, good and faithful servant, we read in the parable of the bags of gold in Matthew. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Jesus was sent to be God's servant. He worked, he suffered, he was rewarded. And we know too that Jesus was here to serve the needs of man. Look at the examples we see throughout the Gospels of him serving the medical needs of man. How many people did Jesus heal physically? Blind people, lame people, deaf, dumb, diseased, demon-possessed. Jesus served the physical needs of man, feeding the multitudes. And Jesus served the spiritual needs of man, teaching, preaching, leading by example. Jesus, in the example that he was setting for us, did not come to be served, but to serve. Jesus came as God's servant. He worked, he suffered, he was rewarded, he served man, fulfilling medical, physical and spiritual needs. Jesus came to be a servant to man, and we're called to be like him. We're called to be a servant for others, just like he was for us. And I just want to take a few minutes to just draw out what I believe 3 key requirements are to be an effective servant of God, serving man based on the example set to us by Jesus. A few years ago when I was in Feltham, we ran a holiday club every year as we do here. And there was one particular year I was responsible for overseeing the teenagers group during the course of the week, because they had a separate group that met in the mornings. And as we worked through this week, we were following a series called Get Dirty. And obviously the week included various hilarious games which involved people getting dirty, covered in something not very nice, or having to eat something not very nice. There was one day that we walked all the young people down to the beach and they did some litter picking as they got dirty, looking after the local environment. But the overall message of that week that we gave the young people was that we must be prepared to get dirty. Not necessarily litter picking or playing silly games, but we must be prepared to get dirty. Think for a moment back to the birth of Jesus. In a barn or a cave, they're not the cleanest of places, are they? And birth itself isn't exactly a sterile activity, is it? You throw a few bales of hay and a couple of goats into the equation and you've got yourself quite a mess, haven't you? I found it quite amusing on Friday night with the children. We watched the film The Nativity. And I don't know whether any of you have seen it, but where they take the children to see a birth. And gradually all the adults pass out at the sight of what's happening. But Jesus spent his life, his ministry getting dirty too. And this was our key message of the week that we had with these young people. He would spend time with others, with people that others wouldn't touch. They wouldn't go near. The lame, the sick, the lepers, the unclean woman, prostitutes, tax collectors. And of course, ultimately, we know that Jesus bore all of our dirt on the cross. Jesus came here to get dirty. And he understood that in order to help people, he had to get dirty, and in order to love people. And he calls us to do the same as we seek to serve him. I often wonder who we'd prefer to have sitting next to us on a bus or at a cinema or a doctor's surgery, or who would we rather associate with ourselves with at work or in our social lives? Who would we rather talk to or sit next to in church even? Doctors, lawyers, managers, smart people, clean, upstanding people, or prostitutes, homeless people, sick people, drug addicts. I read a story this week about a man who would visit a home for really sick people, and he got chatting one day to a young woman who was covered in tumours. Really not a pleasant sight. And after chatting for a long time, as he went to leave, he put his arm around her and he said, "You really are a beautiful person." "Thank you," she replied. "No one has ever gotten close enough to notice." What are we doing as we serve God, as we follow the example of Jesus in serving others, to get dirty? Who are we sitting with? Who are we associating with? How are we serving or loving the forgotten or the rejected or the neglected, the lost, the unlovable? Jesus came to get dirty and calls us to do the same. We also see from Jesus' life that we must be willing to be rejected, to be ignored, to be offended perhaps. Jesus reminds us in John 15:18, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first." How many people turned up at the birth of Jesus? The Bible doesn't tell us exactly. It could have been as few as 3, could have been 20 or 30 shepherds there, but that was about it. The wise men showed up a couple of years later, and even after they'd spread the good news of a new king being born, nobody else bothered to turn up. But Jesus didn't come to receive all this, did he? He came to minister, and he came to serve. As Jesus went through his life, he faced ridicule, he faced insults. People tried to embarrass him, undermine him, destroy him. Pilate gave the crowd a choice when Jesus was on trial. "Jesus or Barabbas," he said. "Crucify him," the crowd shouted. Pilate said, "Why? What crime has he committed?" "Crucify him," the crowd shouted. It's not easy to be nice to people that treat you like this, is it? How do Christians react today when they realise that the world around them doesn't accept them for who they are? When they get laughed at or rejected or left out? When they feel like no one likes them because of what they believe and what they stand for? Do they stand up for what they believe in spite of what's thrown at them, or do they quit and walk away desperate for a normal life? A life where they fit in, where they can go along with what everyone else is doing. When we become a Christian, we sign up to be Christ-like. When we promise to try and live as Jesus did, we surrender to him no matter what. I found this reading this week. I am a soldier in the army of God. Jesus is my commanding officer. The Bible is my code of conduct. I am a volunteer in this army and I am enlisted for eternity. I will either retire in this army at the Lord's return or die in this army, but I will not get out, be talked out or pushed out. I am a soldier. I am a soldier, not a baby. I don't need to be pampered, petted, pumped up, picked up. I am a soldier. No one has to call me, remind me, write me, visit me, entice me or lure me. I am a soldier. No one has to send me flowers, gifts, food, cards, candy or give me handouts. I am a soldier. I do not need to be cuddled, cradled, cared for or catered to. I am committed. I am a soldier. I cannot have my feelings hurt bad enough to turn me around. I cannot be discouraged enough to turn me aside. I cannot lose enough to cause me to quit. I am a soldier. When Jesus called me into his army, I had nothing. If I end up with nothing, I will still come out ahead. I will win. I am a soldier of Christ. We're his soldiers, we're his servants, and there's no greater honour than that, than being called to serve him, and even to serve those who would reject us. So we've seen the example of Jesus, that we are called to get dirty, that we're called to be rejected, and thirdly, we are called to save. How many times have we heard Jesus described as nice? Oh, the Son of Man, he was a nice fellow. It's a term that's sometimes used to describe Christians. And of course, we've got to be nice people. It's one of the many characteristics that should be evident in us so that we stand out from the world around us. But being nice is not our primary focus, is it? Jesus didn't come to be nice. We know that Jesus came to seek out and to save the lost. The Bible doesn't tell us Jesus came to be nice to people. It tells us he came to seek people and to save people. Where are people focused at this time of year? We can make some educated assumptions based on the amount of shopping that they're doing, the way they're rushing around, the terrible driving, the preparing for parties, the family times, wishing each other a happy holiday. An American term perhaps, but one that's creeping its way into our society. We see Xmas written everywhere. Schools and other organisations having winter fairs, not to mention any local C of E schools, of course. A world around us constantly trying to take Christ out of Christmas, and a world that's not necessarily interested in us bringing Jesus into the conversation. But what better time to do it than now? What better excuse do we have as Christians to bring Jesus into the conversation at this time of year? I was at a candlelight carol concert on Thursday evening last week at a local church which shall go unnamed, but it was packed to the rafters. Darcy was singing with all the other children from year 5 and 6 at her school, and there was perhaps 300 parents there. It was literally packed. There was people out of the door. It would be my assumption that the majority of those there aren't believers. I do see and hear them in the playground every day. But this may be the only time that they find themselves in a church in the course of a year. And the reason that Jesus came to earth was not mentioned once. They sung some nice songs. They read some readings. a captive audience, but nothing. You could say it was all very nice, and it was. But nobody got saved from it. Will those people walk back into a church again before next Christmas? Probably not. Were they given any indication as to why they should? No. The only way in which people are going to hear about Jesus is if we tell them. We assume that because we grew up with Bible stories and being taken to Sunday school, that everyone knows Bible stories these days, that today's generation knows them, but they don't. One school that I take assemblies in, one of the teachers specifically said to me, please can you come in and tell the good old Bible stories, because the kids don't know them. They've never been told them. And if somebody doesn't, they perhaps never will. We are called to be nice people, yes, of course. But we're called ultimately to serve the Lord and to seek and to save the lost. We're called to be servants in the example of Jesus. Jesus got dirty, Jesus got unappreciated and rejected, and Jesus got people saved. To close, Max Lucado, in his book God Came Near, wrote this. When God chose to reveal himself to mankind, what medium did he use? A book? No, that was secondary. A church? No, that was consequential. A moral code? No. To limit God's revelation to a cold list of do's and don'ts is as tragic as looking at a Colorado road map and saying that you'd seen the Rockies. When God chose to reveal himself, he did so through a human body. The tongue that called forth the dead was a human one. The hand that touched the leper had dirt under its nails. The feet upon which the woman wept were calloused and dirty. And his tears, oh, don't miss the tears, they came from a heart as broken as yours or mine has ever been. So people came to him. My, how they came to him. They came at night. They touched him as he walked down the street. They followed him around the sea. They invited him into their homes and placed their children at his feet. Why? Because he refused to be a statue in a cathedral or a priest in an elevated pulpit. He chose instead to be Jesus. He chose instead to be a servant. He chose to be the Son of Man who came to be served, not to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And we're called to do the same. From the squalor of a borrowed stable, by the Spirit and a virgin's faith, to the anguish and the shame of scandal came the Saviour of the human race. But the skies were filled with the praise of heaven. Shepherds listened as the angels tell of the gift of God come down to man at the dawning of Emmanuel.